Afternoon, everyone. We are excited to have the VP of Industry Development at Zillow Group, Kurt Beardsley. Kurt, take it away.
Hey, well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. I want to talk to you for a little bit about the intersection of consumer and technology and some of the massive changes that are happening in our industry because of some of the things that are going on in our world. But I also want to talk about how we need to identify the need to change and sometimes look at where we are resisting change and see if we can identify ways to move forward quickly. Now, to do that, I want to step back in time. I'm going to actually look at some history and go back to the turn of the century when the 1800s gave way to the 1900s, the start of the 20th century, because this also was a time of tremendous change in the United States. So we had a huge amount of immigration, people pouring into our cities that was causing change. We also had the Industrial Revolution. And so there were people that were leaving an agricultural-based environment and moving into the cities. And the cities had to adjust to all of these changes. And so as all of these issues came to the cities, they looked at them and they had solutions that came along. So how do you have all these people in a very small area? Well, you build high rises. How do people get up and down the high rises? Well, you develop elevators. And so all of this technology, all of these new innovations were coming into the cities. How do you get people to move around? So they developed trams that could help people move around the cities more easily. But they also had problems that they were struggling to deal with. And one of the big problems they were struggling to deal with was the beloved horse, because the horse was still the primary mode of transportation in cities. So you take a city like New York, and there were 150 to 200,000 working horses in the city, plus all the personal ones. Now, people love the horse, right? So the horse is part of the American tradition. It's what the cowboy rode. It's what pulled the stagecoach. It's what the mail was delivered on in with the Pony Express. But if you've ever worked around horses, or if you've ever mucked out a stable, you know that horses come with a little bit of a problem, and that is horses produce manure. In fact, the average horse, depending on what they're doing, will produce between 15 to 35 pounds a day. That means in a city like New York City, there was 2.5 million pounds of horse manure produced a day. That is 100,000 tons per year, plus 10 million gallons of urine that were dumped on the streets. And so people had to figure out what to do with this. It was a significant problem. Here's a picture of a street in New York City in 1893. And it was deeply covered in manure. And if you need a better picture of what this was like, here's a newspaper quote from the Times. It said, "Literally carpeted with a warm brown matting smelling to heaven." Another newspaper predicted that in 50 years, the average street would be covered with up to 9 feet of manure. So obviously something needed to be done. And of course, waiting in the wings was the automobile. But people were not ready to change over to the automobile. There was a tremendous amount of resistance. So the automobile was a novelty. They lined up along the street like this, and people would pay to ride around the block. But try to, talk about it replacing the horse, and there was a tremendous amount of pushback. People said they were noisy, they're unreliable, they're expensive, there's no infrastructure, there's no gas stations and service stations for them, but there's all those things for the horse. There's no way that the automobile could replace the horse. So this resistance to change is part of human nature. And so we have to look at ourselves every once in a while and say, why am I resisting change that is coming along? Is it because I feel a loss of control? Everything seems different. Am I overwhelmed and stressed? And many of us feel this way during this pandemic. Some people say, well, can I be as successful in this new world? Because I know how it's done in the old world, but I'm unsure whether I fit in this new one. It's a fear of the departure from the status quo. There's also this understanding that change brings possibilities, but it also brings new problems. And sometimes we focus on those problems. It's the better the devil you know than the devil that you don't. So I think it's good to sometimes stop and think, am I resisting some of the changes that are happening in my industry? Now, many of you may say, no, That's not me. I embrace change, and that's awesome. That's probably why you attended this conference today. You're one that's going out to grab the future. So I wanted to introduce you to someone who is like you. Meet Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson. So Dr. Jackson, on a whim and a $50 bet, and maybe just a touch of bravado and maybe a little bit of alcohol, in 1903 made a bet. He made a bet that he could drive an automobile all the way across the United States. Now remember, there weren't roads across the United States. He was going to leave San Francisco and was going to make it to New York. Now, he had a couple of problems, the roads being one of them. The second one, he didn't know how to drive. So the first thing he had to do was learn how to drive. But once he did that, he headed out in his 20 horsepower Winton and his steady companion, a bulldog named Bud, and he made it. He made it all the way across the United States. And if you ever want to study more on this, Ken Burns from PBS made a tremendous little documentary called Horatio's Drive that documents this first travel across the United States. But when he pulled into New York City, it began to cement the fact that, yes, this automobile was a realistic replacement for the horse. There was a possibility to move beyond this manure crisis that they were in and actually see a new future. And of course, New York was never the same again, and neither was the rest of the world. And as we look at it, there's these massive changes that technology are driving into the real estate space. And much of it is because of this pandemic that we're in. This adoption rate of new technology has jumped up. We're in this weird, hard, unprecedented time. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about the pandemic, but just think of our lives and how we have adapted the use of technology. Here, we're all together today on Zoom. If you have kids at home, they're probably doing some school through remote learning. And so this new technology has stepped into our lives. Now, a couple of great things. Real estate is resilient. So we have a very, very resilient industry. As we stepped into this uncertainty, we have actually seen home prices go up 0.7% just in 1 month between July and August. That's the largest increase since 2013, when we were coming out of the Great Depression. From that, we also have seen that it is resilient as far as the time it takes to sell homes. So there was this pause back in March where homes sat there, people were unsure what was going to happen, and then the market has come roaring back. The average time on the market has dropped to almost 2 weeks. It's faster than it was historically, 2 weeks faster than it was just a year ago. So very, very quickly, homes are moving off the shelf and into the hands of new buyers. Now, when we take a look at our site, Zillow, back in March, we did see a decrease in traffic. Was that the orange area there where people were uncertain what's going to happen? They had other things going on. But then the consumers have come roaring back. We are averaging now about 218 million unique users per month on our site. That is 12% higher than this time last year. That's 2.5 billion visits, a number of times they come back per quarter, which is 14% higher than it was this time last year. In fact, when we look over the summer months, we see that engagement is up almost 40% this year over last year. So there is tremendous amount of activity within real estate. People are dreaming about the possibilities of the future, dreaming about something different than what they have today. So we are moving faster to the future than we ever have before. We have new technologies that are being developed faster, they're being implemented faster, and they're being adopted by the consumer faster than before. What's also interesting is how much the consumer has changed. So just a year ago, we did a study and asked consumers what would they think they would be looking for in the future? What would they want to focus on? What was the center of their attention? And in this pre-COVID world, a high percentage of US consumers said they wanted to prioritize experiences. They wanted experience prioritized over products. So, access to concerts and things that engage them, social settings like restaurants, to be able to tour the world. I mean, it's funny, it's almost interesting looking at these pictures and wondering where that world went to, because these are not our experience today. So consumers have radically changed their prioritization, and their prioritization is around virtual experiences. How do we take as many of the experiences that we have and put them into a virtual world? And we have seen 5 years of consumer adoption of change happen in 5 months. That is tremendous change that is going to have impacts well into the future, because we believe many of the things that consumers are adopting today, they're going to stay with. And so consumers are the drivers of the change that are happening. They're the ones in the driver's seat. So I want to take a few minutes and just talk about some of the things that consumers are seeing and doing that are different than before. Well, I mean, first of all, a number of them simply just stopped what they were doing. So we saw almost half of potential sellers either temporarily suspend their houses from the market or not enter the marketplace. So they're sitting on the sidelines, waiting to jump in, looking to see what's happening, looking to see what technologies that are out there. So when they do come onto the market, we expect that they'll come on the market differently than they would have before. I mean, kind of a mundane thing, but 67% say that they're spending more time disinfecting, cleaning their house, and they anticipate that they will do that into the future. So what does it mean? It means they're thinking about how easy their house is to clean. They're thinking about what the house is made of, what the time it takes to go through and clean a house is actually entering into their thinking. And then many are thinking about stopping in-person tours. So we have 41% that say, oh, we're not interested in people coming into our house to take a look at it. And there's this very strong movement towards virtual tours and doing things where you can actually have remote space between the buyers and the sellers. Now, I don't need to focus on why so much of this is grabbing people's attention, because we as an average American are spending over 6 hours per day longer in our homes, many up to 9 hours a day longer in our homes. And so home space has become so much more important, so much part of our daily life than it was in the past. And many of us spend most of that time on Zoom or other video conferencing. And I can't tell you, obviously you have heard some of the embarrassing stories that have come up where things happen in the background of Zoom calls that people didn't anticipate. And so people are thinking more about space and about privacy and how does this work into our future home? Do we think about open spaces? Do we think about private spaces and how that changes our home buying experience? But it certainly has changed people's expectations of how they're going to interact with other people. During COVID, during the pandemic, almost 80% of consumers who are looking to do a transaction said they would prefer to do that transaction without ever having to interact with somebody else. So they would actually like to do it entirely without an interaction with another buyer or seller or even a professional. And a high percentage, 71%, said they expect that will continue into the future. In fact, asked just about interacting with professionals, almost 70% said they would prefer to be able to go through an entire transaction, yes, with a professional, with a real estate professional, but only interacting virtually, not in person. And 63% said they expect that will happen into the future. So these are changing our expectations dramatically. And of course, the way that you search for homes, the way that you engage with homes are going to change as well. 62% said that 3D tours actually help them understand a home much more than static photos. And so, of course, 55% said they really, really wish that more homes had 3D tours available. In fact, over a third of the people who were in our study said that they actually preferred 3D tours over in-person viewing, because they can just bring up their computer, they can walk through the house, they can get a good sense of whether it matches their lifestyle and what they're looking for without having to hop in a car, drive out there and try to tour it in person. And so we believe that some of these technologies are going to stay and become a part of our experience well into the future. When it comes to looking at and booking tours, a high percentage, almost 60%, want to be able to schedule their tours online. And then they would love to actually go to a home, unlock it if it's empty with their own phone and tour the home by themselves. And so we see this drive for the consumer independence in some of the aspects of the home buying experience. In fact, during the pandemic, over a third of the people said they expect to be able to buy a house entirely online. And that's what they're driving for. And almost a third said, as long as it works during the pandemic, we expect that we'll continue to have that same demand after the pandemic is over, doing an entire transaction online. In fact, one of my coworkers recently purchased a house entirely through an online process for them. And much of this is being driven by this massive move to work from home, the ability for the workforce to work from home. So we have 56% of the workforce in the United States working from home. That is a tremendous number of people. And of those, 75% said that they would continue to like to do that at least half time after the pandemic is over. And a number of employers, large employers, have said that for at least the people who are able to work from home, that they're open for that happening. So we see this great reshuffling happen in the relation of people's where they live compared to where they work. And 66% of those who are currently working from home said that they would potentially move if they could work from home as often as they want. So this idea of tethered to work and that environment is actually causing a reshifting in the way people think about homes. Now, do we believe there's going to be an urban flight? Is there going to be an exodus from urban environments? Our data tells us maybe not. Because when we talk to people who are specifically in urban environments, over half of them said they're actually looking for other houses in urban environments. They don't want to leave the urban area. They just may want a different house than they have right now. Now, 16% said they are interested in moving to a more suburban area, have more space, have more affordability in those suburban areas. And 7% said, no, I'm ready to leave the city. I'm going to move to a rural area. So we actually believe that urban areas are going to remain very, very vital. In fact, when we look at home prices since the beginning of the year, so this is through into the pandemic, we actually saw that there was a faster increase in the value of urban homes. Although it's beginning to flatten out, it increased to 4.3% since the beginning of the year, where suburban homes increased about 4.1, but it's a little bit more of a linear curve in that one. And when we look at the search behavior on Zillow, what consumers are looking for, we actually see a tiny decrease in the search for single family homes, which we typically think about as suburban type of homes, down from 82.7 to 81.1, and a small increase in like condos and even vacant land as people begin to rethink their home buying and home living experience. Now, one of the fascinating studies was one we did of renters. So these are renters who are in urban areas who they like the urban areas. It's close to work. They could commute with public transit. They have entertainment. They have restaurants, etc. And the question was, if you could work from home, would you actually think of moving from a renter to a buyer? Which may mean in some of these ultra expensive cities, moving out of the downtown core into a little bit more of a suburban environment. And a huge number, almost 2 million potential buyers are sitting out there in the rental space saying, yes, I would actually look at moving from a renter to a buyer if I had the ability to continue to do a work from home experience. Now, we look at our inventory and say, well, what are they going to buy? Because we have seen inventory levels drop to some of the lowest levels, where right now we have about 1.5 million homes for sale in the United States. And so we believe that real estate is going to stay resilient as a tremendous number of people are interested in looking into the buying space, but the inventory is not always available. So when it comes to this urban move, I think our chief economist said it well. She said, early signals tell us that residents aren't cutting the cord from the central city, but they may be exchanging it for an extension cord. In other words, they may want just a little bit more space between them and the downtown, but they still want access to culture and history and nightlife and all the other things that the urban environments have given us. So when we look at the modern consumer and we look at all the technology that is being put into their hands, they are adopting it readily, and we believe that they are fully looking to keep that technology as they move forward into the next world. And so many of the technologies that we have are being implemented faster by the consumers than they have in the past. And there's nothing more obvious than these virtual engagements. So we look at these 3D tours, these walkthrough. On Zillow's platform, our platform, we saw a 6x increase in consumers using these 3D tours just between the months of February and April of this year. That's a huge increase in consumer activity. And right now we have about 34% of current and soon time home sellers saying that they anticipate offering full virtual walkthroughs of their home. So this is a technology that is absolutely moving quickly. And we also see a lot of consumers and agents involved in remote tours where the agent actually goes out to the house and the agent walks through the house, but the consumers stay in their own environment. And so they do socially distanced tours by video, a Zoom, or other mentality. So that we believe that these technologies are going to continue as we move towards the future for them. So what's next? So we have all this technology, all these changes in consumer expectations. We're living in this new normal where virtual is actually becoming more of a part of our life. Where is this all headed? Well, I have to think back to something that Brad Inman said almost 10 years ago. Brad Inman, the founder of Inman News, when he had this sort of utopian vision of this seamless, endless transaction where someone could actually buy a house as easily as you could walk in and buy a latte. Now, we all know there's tremendous differences between the buying of a cup of coffee and the buying of a house, but the idea of focusing on every one of the friction points and trying to bring this pleasurable transaction to bear is actually where much of this technology is headed. I would settle for the ability to buy a $250,000 house as easy as it is for some people to buy a $250,000 automobile, often which you can do in an afternoon. Well, we know you can't often do that with a house. And so there's a focus on how do we move forward faster. And we envision a day where you can actually do your search and discovery and go from everywhere from financing all the way to closing on a platform that is completely transparent. So the consumer is completely involved in a virtual way every step along the way of their process. Because one of the things that this pandemic has done is it has put a spotlight on where we have unnecessary friction in the buying and selling process, where these antiquated processes actually break down the seamless experience, where we move from online and suddenly have to drop to online to paper, where we have this digital experience, but suddenly have to move to a wet signature or a notary showing up at someone's house. And so the pandemic has focused on those things, and that's where many of the changes are going to be happening. So we have become comfortable over the last few years that real estate is always on, that people are engaged with it at all times of the day. But now this is drive for it always to be on and always to be online as we move forward. So one of the things that is clear is this pandemic has changed the way that we are at Zillow are thinking about real estate. In fact, we came up with this sort of new internal talking point. We talk about Zillow 2.0, where it's moving beyond just search and find, but how do we actually ease the transaction with technology all the way through? How do we help agents work with their clients to smooth out the entire process? And in that process, we actually even changed our mission statement. Our mission statement today is give people the power to unlock life's next chapter. What's blocking their way in buying, in selling, in moving, in renting? And how can we adapt new technologies and new ways to allow people to continue to move on to the next step? So that is our focus. And in this focus, and with the pandemic, and with the adoption of technology, and the changes that are happening in consumer behavior, we believe that the pace of change is going to be even faster. And so sometimes we have to again stop and say, where are we on this process of resisting change, embracing change, moving forward, adopting the next step? How am I going to put myself in a position to take advantage of what is coming along in the future as consumers begin to change? And for those of us who embrace change, for those of us who love change, there's sometimes this other thing that pops up that causes us to be resistant to it. And that is when we see change happening and it's not us that take the first advantage. When we see someone who we may view as our competitor taking a step forward, when they adapt to change maybe slightly faster than we do, Do we have a resistance to that change, or can we actually look at that and study it and say, what did they do? And how can I leapfrog them? How can I take what they have done and actually jump to the next step and actually do something that is more innovative and more taking us towards the future? So to do that, I want to end with another story. And this is a story that you are probably fairly familiar with, but maybe a part of the story that you're not. And for this, let me take you back to 1957. So in 1957, the United States, well, and frankly, the world was shocked when the Soviet Union launched the first low orbit satellite into space called Sputnik. Now, there were lots of reactions to Sputnik being up there, but one of the reactions was, well, we don't believe it. And the Soviet Union knew that that was going to be a problem. So when they launched Sputnik, they intentionally built into it the ability for it to have an electronic beep. So anybody with the right technology could actually find it in space and actually know that it was there. Now, again, there were lots of reactions. Some people were afraid. Some people, like the US space program moved into high gear and started moving faster. But other scientists said, you know what? For the first time in human history, we have something that is circling the Earth that is beeping, so we know exactly where it is. I wonder what we can learn from that. And so they begin to study the beep, and they begin to study the Doppler effect of it, and they begin to predict where it would be in the future and see if it was there. And yes, it was there. And then they said, hey, if we know where it is, I wonder if we can use it to help us actually find out where other things are on Earth. So can it help us to discover how to move from point A to point B on Earth? And while this satellite was circling the Earth, these scientists got together and developed the mathematics that actually gave us modern day GPS. And so when you hop in your car and you type in an address and you follow that dot to the next spot, you can actually thank the Sputnik, because the ability for them to track it gave us the technology that actually led into our modern GPS systems. Now, we don't know where all this technology is going to lead us and where all the consumer changes are going to be. We're in the middle of a bunch of flux right now as we deal with this pandemic, but we do know that if we have learned anything, it's home is more important than ever. And at Zillow, we are fascinated about creating new technology and new experiences that delight the consumer, that actually meets the consumer exactly where they are, to help the consumer meet the things that they want, to get to the place in their life that they want to be, and bring the industry along with us as we take this next step forward. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.